Okay, so I am gonna give this a second go. I did everything the first time and lost all of my audio files when saving my PowerPoint slides. So we will try round number two. Hopefully this one's gotta be better than the first one, right? Okay, so let's do the cardiovascular system right now. We're gonna look at chapter 13. This is a great unit because we actually get to apply everything to or in the lab that we're going to do in a couple weeks. So I'm really excited for you. This is it is a tedious lab. It is not tedious in a bad way, but there's a lot of work that has to go into it. It's fun. The report is a lot of work. Learning all of this content is a lot of hard work. So hopefully I can help you through it. If you have any questions, write it down. I can help you next week with that. And watch any of the videos that I post online. Um, and then make sure that if you get tired of listening to my voice, just pause the video and then come back when you're ready to keep going. Okay, here we go. So looking at the cardiovascular system, it's considered a closed circuit because it loops. So it's not open in any areas to the rest of the body, but it's a closed loop that contains everything within the blood vessels. It consists of the heart and the blood vessels. And I've kind of color coordinated that the red blood vessels, the arteries, and the capillaries are oxygen rich. So anything red is oxygen rich, and anything blue, like the veins, are deoxygenated or oxygen poor. Okay, so our blood vessels are made up of arteries, capillaries, veins, and venules, actually. So functioning, how the cardiovascular system works is it works to supply oxygen and any nutrients to the tissues and the cells, and it also removes any waste from our systems. When we look at oxygen poor blood, this is what is carried by the pulmonary circuit. So within our cardiovascular system, we have two circuits: the pulmonary circuit that carries oxygen poor blood to the lungs, and then we also have the systemic circuit, and I think I forgot to highlight this part, but the systemic circuit is oxygen rich and it carries blood to all of our cells. So when we look at oxygen poor blood, or the pulmonary circuit, this is blood being carried by the heart to the lungs, picking up oxygen in the lungs and dropping off waste products such as CO2. Looking at the systemic circuit, we have oxygen-rich blood coming back from the lungs, where it has just picked up all of this oxygen cells, or oxygen through the hemoglobin on the cells, and it's dumping it back into the heart and then out to the systemic circuit, which is the rest of the body, so dropping off oxygen to all the cells and tissues and then picking up carbon dioxide. So it's this cyclical kind of process where we send fresh, clean blood to the body, rich in oxygen, and we pick up kind of dirty blood, or blood heavy in waste and carbon dioxide, and bring it back to the heart for cleaning. So here's our heart. Hopefully we see something a little bit fresher than this in the lab, but you can see the various blood vessels, the major vessels of the heart, and the vessels that supply blood to the heart themselves as well. This is a pretty cool x-ray of the thorax, and so you can see your ribs right here. This is an anterior view, but you can see the heart situated right there, right above the diaphragm, along the mediastinum, and a little more to the left. This is the systemic and pulmonary circuit. So we will go into more detail of this soon, but the systemic circuit again delivers oxygen-rich blood to the bodies, or the body, and the pulmonary circuit carries oxygen-poor blood to the Pulmonary circuit carries oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. You can see the arrows here. So the thin black arrows show the direction of the blood, and then the thicker arrows here show diffusion actually happening in that simple squamous epithelium of the lungs. So let's just kind of cover the basics of the flow of blood just so that you have a basic understanding as we go into some of the terminology and look at some of the components of the heart here. The deoxygenated blood returns to the heart from the systemic circuit, so the body, these are the capillaries and the tissues. They enter through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava into this chamber right here, which is called your right atrium. From there, blood will enter into the right ventricle. Remember, this is your right side. This is your anatomical left side. So this is your right atrium, right ventricle. And then you can see that there are various cusps or valves here that allow for blood to flow, and they function in helping blood to flow in only one direction, similar to the valves that were in the lymphatic capillaries. Here is our pulmonary trunk, and because it's pulmonary, it's taking blood, deoxygenated blood, to the lungs. From the pulmonary trunk, we see extensions to the left and to the right lung through what are called the pulmonary arteries. Okay? They go to the lungs, CO2 is released, oxygen is picked up, and then through the pulmonary veins, blood is sent back into the left atrium, down through this valve right here into the left ventricle, where it is then pumped out into the aorta through an aortic valve. And this strong, elastic, thick-walled aorta sends blood far because it has high pressure, so it sends blood to the rest of the body. So in terms of looking at the walls, notice that the thickness of the walls are different for the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So the right ventricle only has to pump blood to the lungs, which is a fairly close vicinity, but the walls of the left ventricle are very thick because it needs to have high enough pressure to pump blood to the rest of the body. Okay, let's look at the structure of the heart. The heart is a hollow cone-shaped muscular pump within the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity. So hopefully all that makes sense to you because you've been reviewing some of the terminology. But the thoracic cavity is your trunk. Mediastinum is the middle point vertically in your body. Okay. Size and location. The average adult has a heart that's about 14 centimeters in length and 9 centimeters wide. It's situated between the lungs, anterior to your vertebral column, and then behind your sternum. There are two pieces of terminology here, so the base and the apex. And the base lies between the second rib, or beneath the second rib, and the apex extends to the fifth intercostal space. So the base is the, I'm going to show you where that is in the heart, right here. So right there, you can see that this is the base of the heart. So this is the major vessels would extend from there, and the apex is the corner right there. Okay, so this is that x-ray, and you can see right here where the heart sits above the diaphragm, between the lungs, along the mediastinum, beneath the sternum. And you can see about 5 centimeters in width, so they're saying on average it's about 9 centimeters in width and then 14 centimeters in length. So switching over to looking at the coverings of the heart. So we're going to talk about the coverings of the heart and the walls of the heart. So they're two separate things, but they do overlap. So the coverings of the heart include the pericardium. So this pericardium is pretty cool. It's this sac that encloses the heart. And what you can do at the dissection is hopefully they maintain the pericardium on the heart, but you can physically just pick up this huge heart that probably weighs about 30 grams or so, and pick it up with just the pericardium sac, this membranous sac, and just lift it with that sac. That's how strong these fibrous tissues are. So the two portions of the pericardium is this stronger fibrous pericardium. This is the outer, tougher piece of connective tissue, and you can see it right in here. Okay, and then inside is this thinner, more delicate, double-layered serous pericardium. Okay, and we're going to see what the serous pericardium is made of on the next slide. But notice that the fibrous pericardium is this thick external component, And then there's a layer right underneath it that folds, and then we end up actually getting two different layers out of that. So let's see what these are. So the serous pericardium, which is the thinner, more delicate, double-layered membrane that covers the heart, is made up of three components: the parietal pericardium, the visceral pericardium, and the pericardial cavity. So the parietal pericardium is actually the outer layer of your serous pericardium. Okay, so there's the fibrous pericardium, and then on the inner side of that fibrous pericardium is actually the parietal pericardium. So it kind of doubles in function. So it's part of the fibrous, it's just this underneath layer that folds over, but it lines the inner surface. So you can see that lines the inner surface of the fibrous pericardium. So let's go back to that. So it's this guy right here. Okay, so we've got the fibrous pericardium, and then the parietal pericardium is the inner component of that fibrous membrane, but it's the most outside part of the serous pericardium. Okay, then we have the visceral pericardium, also known as the epicardium. So this guy has dual function as well. Okay, so the visceral pericardium is part of this covering of the heart. And remember that when we look at the term visceral, it means organ. So this is the pericardium that sits directly on the organ of the heart. So it's the inner layer and it covers the heart. Okay, and just keep in mind it's going to be called the epicardium later on when we talk about the wall of the heart. And then because there was that fold over in that tissue, we have this pericardial cavity. So there's a gap. And in that pericardial cavity, it contains the serous fluid. Okay, so it's the space between the visceral and the parietal layers, but it contains it contains a serous fluid that helps in cushioning the heart, that protective cushioning in case of any type of impact, and it reduces the friction between the layers, right? Imagine if there were no fluid between those layers, then the tissues would just stick together and there would be high in friction. So let's go back again. Fibrous pericardium, beneath that, so this 1, 2, 3 is the serous pericardium, but the inner component of the fibrous pericardium is also called the parietal pericardium, and then that folds over, and the inner part of that fold is the visceral pericardium that sits right on so this is the wall of this is the muscle of the heart. And between these two pieces of pericardium is the pericardial cavity, which contains a serous fluid that helps reduce friction between these two layers. So there's the pericardium again, that layer that surrounds the heart. You've got the visceral pericardium that sits right on the organ, the pericardial cavity that's filled with serous fluid, and then the parietal pericardium, which is also the inner component of the fibrous pericardium. There's the pericardium again, and there's that larger muscle. So this is that larger picture, so that's figure 13.2. So in here what we have in this diagram is also the superior vena cava, the aorta, and then you've got this membrane that covers the heart. Okay, so now that we've looked at the membrane that covers the heart, we're going to also talk about the wall of the heart. So the wall of the heart is composed of three different layers: the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. So let's go back to the first one. Oh. The epicardium is the same piece of tissue as the visceral pericardium. So remember when we were talking about the covering of the heart, I said that there's this light tissue that sits on the heart called the visceral pericardium. Well, this is the same as the epicardium. This is the same as the epicardium. So this is the outermost layer. It's that serous membrane, and it provides protection against friction in the heart. Then we have the myocardium. The myocardium is that thick middle layer of the cardiac muscle. So when we think about heart muscle, this is generally the tissue that we're thinking of. Okay, so the myocardium is the thick layer of the wall that pumps blood out of the chambers. So it's thick and it's strong, and it's basically all of the cardiac muscle that does all the pumping action. Then we have the endocardium. Remember that endo means inner, so this is the innermost component of the wall of the heart. So this is made of connective tissue and epithelium, and it's continuous with the endothelium of major vessels joining the heart. So the major blood vessels that join the heart are actually continuous with this endocardium. It contains Purkinje fibers, which are a part of the cardiac conduction system. And we're going to talk more about that later on. But it's another fun word to say, right? Purkinje fibers. So here's the visual of that. So take a little cross section of the heart muscle, and we have that starting from the outermost section, the fibrous pericardium. The infold of that is the parietal pericardium. And then between that and the visceral pericardium is the serous cavity, or the pericardial cavity filled with serous fluid. Then the same anatomical feature, which is known as the visceral pericardium, that is when we switch over and talk about the wall of the heart now, that is called the epicardium. Then this chunk here that looks like a big piece of sushi, it's actually muscle, so yeah. So this is your muscle tissue, this is the myocardium, and then we have the inner layer of the heart wall, which is the endocardium. Okay, so there's epi, myo, nice and thick, and then endo, the innermost. And you can see the different chambers of the heart here already. This is a great picture. This is something that you'll probably see in your dissection. Okay, so, sorry, I'm just texting. I can't stop the video and pause. Here we go. Okay, let's talk heart chambers and valves. So the heart contains 4 chambers that we just saw really nicely in this diagram right here. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and 4. The 2 top ones are actually the atrium. So this would be anatomically your right side and your left side. Okay, so this is your right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. So the atria receive blood returning to the heart. So they have thinner walls because all they're doing is they're just receiving blood, okay? And then they pass it on to the ventricles. But the atria, they have these ear-like auricles that project exterior from them, okay? And you'll see that in the dissection. It's pretty cool. Then we have these thick muscled ventricles, okay? They function to pump blood out of the heart. So because they're pumping blood out of the heart, they need to be thicker than the atria that are just receiving. So let's go have a look at that again. Okay, thinner walls, receiving blood, thicker walls, pumping blood out of the heart. Finally, we have the septum. So the septum separates the atrium and the ventricle from the right and left. Okay, so let's go back to this guy. Right here is our interventricular septum, and then you would have your atrial septum up here. So that's the wall that separates right from left on the heart. So just some pretty cool images or visual images of the heart. So you can see the right and left atrium. So this is anteriorly, and then the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And notice that the ventricle and the ventricle on the right side and left side, they don't go down immediately this way like we would imagine. So it does sort of take this curve. So take that into consideration when you do your dissection. Okay, this is a posterior view. And then internally, which we had a nice view of in that big heart initially. Okay, so the right, left atrium up at the top, and then the right and left ventricles. You can notice that the thickness in the walls, again, is much, much different. And even the thickness between the right ventricle and left ventricle is there because they both serve a different function, right? The right ventricle is only going to pump blood to the lungs, which is close in vicinity, and then the left ventricle pumps blood to the whole body, which means that it needs higher pressure and so it needs stronger muscle force. You can see right here, these are, later on we're going to talk about chordae tendineae, but the valves, these are attached to valves, and they help with the movement of blood flow through these different chambers. These guys right here are called your pectinate muscles. You're going to need to know those for the dissection. So they're on, you'll see them, they're kind of like little comb features, comb-like structures, sort of is what they call them, but it's pretty clear here that, and you're going to need to be able to identify these when you cut open the heart. You can see really clearly here, these are some of the pectinate muscles on the left-hand side that combine with these chordae tendineae that help open and close valves of the heart. Okay, so let's start talking about the valves of the heart. So the valves sit between chambers essentially, and they assist in making sure that blood flows in only one direction. So sometimes we have valves that go between the ventricle and atria, and sometimes we have valves that go between the chamber and a blood vessel. The atrioventricular valve is the ones that go between, based on the name, atrium and the ventricles. Okay, so nice. Some of the things we want to start putting together just logically, how can I figure out where this thing goes, right? So we know there's an atrium, we know there's a ventricle. So short form is the AV valve, it's the atrioventricular valve. And we've got two of them because we have two atria and two ventricles. So the first one on your anatomical right side is your right atrioventricular valve, or your tricuspid valve. And then on the left-hand side, we have the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve. Okay, and guess why they are named the way that they are named? Well, the right atrioventricular valve, or the tricuspid valve, has 3 cusps that make up the valve, and the left one has 2 cusps. Okay, and they attach to what I showed you before, these chordae tendineae. So they're cords that are kind of like tendony type of material. Okay, so these chordae tendineae, they attach to papillary muscles that are at the bottom, of your ventricles. Okay, on the inner wall of the heart, that should say heart. Papillary muscles will contract during ventricular contraction, and this helps prevent the backflow of blood through the AV valves. So we have these papillary muscles that contract. So when the heart has this electrical conduction pass through, it causes these muscles to contract, and they pull on the chordae tendineae, and because the chordae tendineae are attached to the AV valves, it will help to pull them down, and when they pull down, then blood can flow through. So these are the valves. So let's look at the diagram here. If we were to take a cross section like that and just look down from the superior view, this is anterior, this is posterior, then we have our tricuspid valve on the right with 3 cusps. You could sort of see that 1, 2, and 3. And then on this end, that's actually 1 right there. It's hard to see. It looks like more than that, but it's just because it's a preserved specimen, it's hard to tell. But this is what it would generally look like in a healthy, proper heart. A bicuspid valve would have 2 cusps. Okay. And then you can see this is the aortic valve, and as I mentioned before, sometimes you have a valve that connects between a chamber and a blood vessel. So the aortic valve is actually connected from the left ventricle to the aorta, and the pulmonary valve is actually connected from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk. Okay, and that's what they would look like there. So there are the valves right there, connected to the chordae tendineae, and then connected to the papillary muscles. And they're big and strong, especially on the left-hand side. Okay, I'm just going to skip this because this slide is actually out of place. So let's go back to this Okay, so talking about valves, we've talked about the atrioventricular, which includes the tricuspid on the right-hand side, and then the bicuspid or the mitral valve on the left-hand side. We also have the semilunar valves. So these are the valves that are connected to the ventricle, or that connect a ventricle and its blood vessel. Okay, so the right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs through what's called the pulmonary trunk. At the base of the pulmonary trunk is our pulmonary semilunar valve, which prevents the backflow of blood into the right ventricle. Then our left ventricle pumps blood to the systemic circuit, or to the body, through the aorta. And so at the base of the aorta, we have the aortic semilunar valve, which again, as with all valves, prevents the backflow of blood into its previous chamber. Okay, so this is what it would look like. So here's our tricuspid, right? Our bicuspid, our pulmonary valve, and then behind, they're just tucked underneath because that's our aorta. Between the aorta and the left ventricle is your aortic valve. So I'm going to go back to this slide now here, just because it was out of place. Okay, so just looking at the heart chamber again, some components of the heart that we want to talk about include this first one. The, where did it go? Sorry. So the superior and inferior vena cava. So if you look, actually turn to page 354 or figure 13.5, you'll see that big blue vertical vein. Okay, this is called a major vessel of the heart. This is one of the major vessels of the heart. So the superior vena cava is the one that extends up superiorly. And then the inferior vena cava is the component, so it's the same vein, it's just different, going in different directions. The inferior vena cava is down, coming out at the bottom. Okay, and the function of these vena cava, cavae, V-A-E would be plural, is to help bring blood back from the body to the right atrium. Okay, the next term we want to look at is the coronary sinus. So this drains blood from the myocardium to the right atrium. So the myocardium is that strong, thick wall of the muscle that actually does all the pumping action. So not only does the heart have blood flowing through it, and not only is its function to pump blood to the body, but it's a muscle in itself, and therefore it needs to contain oxygen and nutrients and everything that the rest of the body needs. So it's really important that our blood being pumped through the heart is high in oxygen and clean and getting rid of all the wastes. And so we have our own coronary circulation within the heart. And the coronary sinus is the area that drains the deoxygenated blood back into the right atrium. Okay, I've mentioned this already, but the right ventricle has a thinner wall than the left ventricle because the right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs, which is close, and the left ventricle pumps blood into the systemic system, which is far. Okay, we talked about this one. And so there is our heart. Okay, so there's our superior and our inferior vena cava, our right atrium, our tricuspid valve, our right ventricle, our pulmonary valve, our pulmonary trunk out to the heart, our left atrium, our bicuspid valve, our chordae tendineae, you can see that there, but in our left ventricle, aorta, right pulmonary artery that goes to the heart, to the lungs, and then right pulmonary vein, left pulmonary vein that brings oxygenated blood back from the lungs to the heart. Here's a nice little table for you, table 13.1 on page 355, that just summarizes all of the heart valves for you. And here's a look at some of the semilunar valves again. This is the pulmonary semilunar valve. So this is taking blood from the right atrium to the pulmonary trunk and then out the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Then you have the aortic semilunar valve that's bringing oxygenated blood from the left ventricle out to the aorta, through these valves, and then to the rest of the body. Actually, what this diagram is showing is a mitral valve prolapse. So you can see that this valve is nice and strong, and then this one has lapsed. So you can actually sometimes, if valves don't work, you can actually get a heart murmur. That's what a heart murmur is. And we never really want blood to flow back, but sometimes if the valve is not functioning properly, then you can get this leaking of blood back into its previous chamber. So that's what a heart murmur is. You sort of hear like a whoosh whoosh kind of noise. That's what the doctor's listening for, but a heart murmur is a failure of a valve to close properly and prevent leakage of the blood back into its previous chamber. Okay. So looking now, let me go back here. The rings of dense connective tissue, these exist around the pulmonary trunk and aorta. And basically what it does, it prevents any dilating of any of the outlets of the atria and ventricles in the heart valve and muscle fiber areas. Okay, so it prevents, it kind of creates this fibrous ring. And if you go over to page 355, figure 13.6, let me see if I can find that. This one right here. Okay, this diagram right here, you can see this fibrous skeleton. So it just keeps everything a little bit firm, and so that things don't kind of loosen up. Let me go back to my slides here. But this is called the skeleton of the heart. Okay, it's an area that provides attachment for the valves and muscle fibers, but really the function is to prevent any dilating of these outlets of the heart. Okay, blood flow through the heart. This is a heavy slide. What I'd like to do is go through this in the next diagram with you. And what I really encourage you to do is go through this diagram on your own. So the next one is, this is the diagram related to this slide right here. So that's on page 356, figure 13.7. And this is really the flow of blood through the heart. It's important to know this is something that I'd like for you to know, that you're going to know really well. So that you can take that into next year. So take some time and work through this on your own, but what we're going to do is I'm going to work through it with you using the diagram. Okay, so again, let's start with the body tissues. We have, let me grab my laser pointer. So going with the body tissues, we have deoxygenated blood being sent back into the superior and inferior vena cava, going into the right atrium. From the right atrium, deoxygenated blood, it's blue, right? Heavy in carbon dioxide, heavy in wastes, passes into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve, and then it passes into the pulmonary trunk through the pulmonary valve. Remember that everything pulmonary means that it's going to the lungs. So from the pulmonary trunk, the deoxygenated blood exits through the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery into the lungs. And from there, carbon dioxide diffuses out and oxygen diffuses into the circulatory system. Now we have oxygen-rich blood. Oxygen-rich blood is going to exit the lungs through the pulmonary veins on the right side and the left side. And these are going to empty into the left atrium. From there, the blood passes into the left ventricle via the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. And from there, the blood is passed into the aorta through the aortic semilunar valve. From the aorta, the oxygenated blood is then brought back into the systemic system so that our tissues can be refilled with nutrients and oxygen. Okay, so that is the blood flow through the heart. It's important to know the pulmonary circuit deals only with the lungs or deals with sending blood back to the lungs. The systemic blood deals with sending blood, oxygen-rich blood, to the body. I can't remember if I've mentioned this already, but I do want to highlight one thing. The pulmonary artery and the pulmonary veins. Actually, I should do that in color, but I don't know how to do. Can I reset? Oh, nope, 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 nope. That doesn't work. Let's do. Okay, so the pulmonary artery. I'm gonna recolor in blue. Okay, so arteries are blood vessels that send blood out of the heart. Okay, every artery moves away from the heart, and every vein moves to the heart. This is the only instance where we have an artery moving away from the heart carrying deoxygenated blood. Okay, every other artery moves away from the heart but carries oxygenated blood. The pulmonary artery moves away from the heart carrying deoxygenated blood. The same thing with the veins. All veins would be blue, right? All veins carry deoxygenated blood to the heart. But this is the only case where we have a pulmonary vein because it's a vein because it's moving towards the heart, but it's a vein that's rich in oxygenated blood because it's coming from the lungs. So your pulmonary veins are the only veins that carry oxygen-rich blood to the heart. Okay, next. So still with the idea of blood supply to the heart, the first branches off of the aorta are the right and left coronary arteries. Okay, so remember that the heart has to be supplied with a good supply of oxygenated blood. And so the very first branches off of the aorta, or the very first thing that the aorta does, is it supplies oxygen-rich blood to the heart itself, the heart muscle, through the right and left coronary arteries. And if you have a look at, I think we're going to see this in the diagram, but this is the very, very important thing to do and the first thing that the aorta does. Okay, the coronary arteries, why people have coronary heart attacks is because if your arteries are clogged, then that's going to cause the heart to build up a higher pressure because it's going to need to work harder to move the blood through these clogged arteries, right? That's what atherosclerosis is. A buildup of plaque in your arteries. So you lose elasticity, your diameter of your blood vessels gets smaller, and so it takes more work for your heart to pump blood through the rest of your body. But as your heart needs to work harder to pump blood, because your heart needs to work harder to pump blood through the rest of your body, it starts to get bigger. And because it starts to get bigger, it isn't actually being filled with all of the blood from the right and left coronary arteries, right? So if your heart grows because it's getting bigger, because it's doing more work, because you have more plaque in your system, that doesn't mean that the left and right coronary arteries are growing with it. And when your heart grows to a point where these arteries can't reach certain areas of the heart, then you have muscle tissue that's not being filled with oxygen and not being nourished. And so part of your heart starts to die off. So that's part of a reason why coronary heart attacks will happen. Okay, that was a side note, but let's keep going. So blood flow increases during the relaxation of ventricles because the myocardial vessels are not compressed. Okay, and then again, because of that constant pumping action of the heart, our cardiac muscle cells require a continual supply of oxygen. Branches of the coronary arteries feed many capillaries of the myocardium. Okay, so it's not just the coronary arteries, but they extend out into many, many different types of capillaries that will feed the heart as well. Branches of coronary arteries often have connections between them called anastomosis. Anastomosis. Sorry, I always have issues with that word. Anastomosis. And so these are connections are basically different pathways for blood. Okay, if a pathway gets blocked in the heart, then because we need to find different ways to nourish the heart, then the blood will be flowed through in different pathways. Our arteries are super cool. Even outside of the heart, blood flow actually increases to your digestive system when you're eating. So sometimes what happens is blood will get cut off from other areas of your body, and more flow will be redirected back to your stomach for digestion. Pretty cool. Cardiac veins drain blood from the heart muscle, and also carry it to the coronary sinus, which is what empties that deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. Okay, so cardiac veins, same idea. Any vein will carry, except for the pulmonary vein. Cardiac veins carry blood that's deoxygenated. So this is basically deoxygenated blood that's been drained from the tissues of the heart muscle, carried to the coronary sinus, and then emptied into the right atrium to go and get oxygenated. So these are some cool pictures. The right coronary artery, you can see that right there. Hopefully we get to see these in our dissection. So this is the right coronary artery branches, so some of the branches of the right. So that's the right coronary artery right here. So you're looking at some of the different arteries that branch off of it. And then the coronary vein. So these are the branches that come off of the coronary vein. It's pretty cool. This is the coronary sinus. Okay, so this is the vein that, this is where the collection of deoxygenated blood comes from after it goes through the heart and then empties into the right atrium. Okay, so you can see right here as well, this is figure 13.8 on page 357. This is that right coronary artery. Okay, so your artery, your aorta right here, the very first thing it does is it has these branches off where it supplies the heart muscle. So your heart muscle is actually the first one to get new, clean, or fresh, clean blood. Okay, so if we were to take that aorta out, so when you actually do the dissection to look at the aortic cusps, look for your coronary arteries in that area as well. So here are looking at the surface blood vessels, but I'm just going to take this opportunity to just review some of the anatomy of the heart again. Okay, so your right ventricle, left ventricle, the apex of the heart, the base of the heart right here, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, right auricle, left auricle. Your right atrium is going to be in here, and your left atrium is going to be somewhere over there. We've got the right pulmonary artery, right pulmonary veins, left pulmonary artery, left pulmonary veins, the trunk, pulmonary trunk, and I think that's it. This is the posterior view. So now you can see the atrium a little bit better from the posterior view. And that's it. Okay, so we'll carry on with heart actions in the next, let me see, hold on, what did I do here? Yeah, we'll carry on with heart actions in the next unit, on the next class, but we'll stop here for today, I think. Yeah, we'll stop here. So what I'd like you to do is just review the different parts of the heart, and then review the pathways of the heart as well. So figure 13.1, and what we'll do is I'll bring a blank diagram for that, or I'll post a blank diagram for that, and I'd like you to work through the direction of the flow. So for this guy right here, I'd like you to work through the direction of the flow of blood through the heart as your homework.